Hey everyone, out on a walk today and going to be speaking about conditional tooltips. So firstly, tooltips. We know them, we love them. The idea that when you hover over an element or focus on the element, you display some additional information. And this is really common in interfaces. And I think a really sort of classic example of this is when you have a button, which is just an icon, so an icon button. And it's not always obvious to every user what a particular icon means. And so you have an element that sort of pops up when you either hover or focus on the element, which gives some text information about what this button will do. So if you have, say, like an old school floppy disk as your save icon, when you hover over that icon, it's a little pop-up comes up next to it and just says save on it. And these are everywhere in interfaces. It's such a helpful pattern to have these sort of additional information available to people. Now, the browser does have a built-in mechanism for doing tooltips, specifically the title attribute on elements. However, they're actually not that helpful. You can't style them. You can't have any kind of additional rules around them. They kind of look really bad as well. And so you'll find that they're generally not used. Instead, what you'll have is people will create their own tooltip abstractions. And with the new popover API and specifically the hint, like popover equals hint kind of role, it's actually quite easy for people to wire up their own tooltip abstractions that work really well in browsers. Now, one use case that people often use tooltips for is for displaying text that was truncated. So let's say you have a button and that button has too much text in it, maybe due to some spacing constraints, or it's a language that's a bit more wordy, and for whatever reason that button's width can't continue to grow. What we'll often see is that button will become truncated, so the text will get an ellipsis on the end of it, and then and so in order for that button layout not to break. But the drawback of that approach then is that you can't actually see, like sometimes some really important information about that control is cut off by the ellipsis, by the truncation. And so what is a very common pattern is that you'll add a tooltip to that button, which has the full text. So even if due to space constraints, you can't see the whole content in that element, then you will show the tooltip with the full content. Now, I also just want to be clear that this is kind of a fallback in that often the answer is just avoid truncation. So if you can, in certain experiences, just say wrap the text, show more lines, that's often the better approach for accessibility and clarity. Just don't lean on these patterns. However, that's not always the case. That is an option available to you. Like let's say you have, I mentioned buttons, but also say a sidebar, which has the names of pages in the sidebar, of files, whatever it is. They can be quite long, and it can look really bad if they kind of wrap around. So you have inconsistent line heights in that sidebar. And so I would say that often it's appropriate and good to use truncation when you're talking about UI controls or anything that sort of has a fixed constraints around its width. You kind of lean towards using truncation, potentially with a tooltip. The trouble is, though, is that if you're naive about this, you can end up just kind of drowning users in tooltips, right? I'm sure people have seen this. You hover over a sidebar, you move your mouse up and down, and you kind of just get tooltips popping up everywhere. And that's because what someone's done is gone, okay, sometimes this text can be truncated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap them in a tooltip, show the text so it's always there. And that's cool. But it's really frustrating if that text wasn't truncated and you still get the tooltip. You'll see this kind of everywhere if you start looking for it, where people kind of go, oh, okay, this can sometimes be truncated, so I'm going to put a tooltip on it. But I think the most desirable outcome would be only show the tooltip if the text is truncated, because you don't actually need to show the tooltip if nothing's being truncated. So what I've been working on, in this is, in my own kind of design system and in other places as well, is this idea that your tooltip, let's just say it's a React component, accepts a prop called can appear, and that will get called when focus is occurring or when the user is mousing over the tooltip, and you get to decide whether the tooltip opens or not. And what I've done is created a little function called has truncated text, and what that's going to do is just check to see if the element inside the tooltip has any kind of child element that has truncated text. And if that returns true, then show the tooltip. But if it returns false, i.e. nothing inside here is truncated, then you don't need to show the tooltip. And that pattern works really nicely. However, figuring out whether something is truncated is not, you would wish there was some CSS selector like has truncated text or something, but yeah, unfortunately that doesn't exist. So what you actually need to do is recursively look through every single element and check to see if its client width is less than its scroll width. And if that is true for any element, then there's going to be some truncated text in there, specifically when you have elements that don't wrap. Now, that recursive search, you need to be a little bit nuanced around, because some elements that you have a tooltip on may have layers inside them open. So like with the new popover API, you're often rendering layered elements as children of other elements. And so if you have this outer element that actually has a tooltip, but then this inner element is rendering a layer, you don't want to also search through all of its children to see if anything in there is truncated. So effectively, on that recursive search, you just stop searching if you run into a popover or a dialog element. That's kind of like the boundary of the search, and you just exit at that point. This also facilitates a really nice experience. So if you have a UI control that is being truncated due to constraints, you can show a tooltip to users to give them the full description of what that text was, the full representation of that text. And if it's not being truncated, you don't need to show the tooltip. So you're kind of only showing it when it's actually needed. I've found this to be a really nice pattern that works super well across interfaces, and I hope you find it helpful and this talk interesting as well. All right, catch you later. Bye.